It's my extreme pleasure to welcome to Extinction Radio today Rory Varrato. Rory's from Western Pennsylvania, a rural area and Trump country, and really has his pulse on the mind of the mass consciousness, I would say. He also attended Arizona State University, and he has studied political theory and international relations, and he's currently at Columbia University doing his I think his PhD work in philosophy. He's a great thinker. He's done TEDx talks. He is got a lot to say. So with that, Rory, welcome to Extinction Radio. So good to have you here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So Rory, you've kind of had a long and varied journey, and I kind of want to delve into your work just to reference your latest work. Your latest work is We Are the Threat, Reflections on Near-Term Human Extinction. I mean, it's an incredible work. I recommend anyone to take a look at it. Just do a search in Google for We Are the Threat, Reflections on Near-Term Human Extinction by Rory Varrato. And it's sort of a tour de force. It's really very comprehensive. But Rory, it's been a long journey for you to get here. I've noticed that you lived in different parts of the country and that you've had different experiences, studied different things. And, you know, you've done TEDx talks, which were very well viewed. I saw one that was like 35,000 views, very thoughtful talk. What is it that makes you tick, and why are you the way you are, and what drives you?
That's a great question, and a big question. I think, you mentioned that I'm currently at Columbia working on my PhD in philosophy, but the program is actually philosophy and education. And I think that emphasis is important for me now because I'm so focused on teaching. And, the great influence in my life, a former mentor of mine once told me that all teaching is autobiographical. So with that in mind, I think it is important to discuss, life stories in the context of how we end up circling around this topic of near-term human extinction. So how did I get here? As you mentioned, I'm from Western Pennsylvania, rural, sort of deep Trump country. After high school, I managed to move across the country to Arizona and attended Arizona State. And that was a sort of an experience of culture shock for me, even though it's still within the United States. To move from a rural area on the East Coast or in Appalachia to a major city in the West, in the Southwest, was definitely a shock. And it took me a while to adapt. But in doing so, I gained so many new perspectives on so many things. For instance, I had been sort of ensconced in a very conservative political milieu. Many of my family members and friends came from conservative backgrounds, evangelical sort of religious beliefs, etc. And having those challenged, the experience of having those challenged, those things that I had taken for granted, was, I think, an important step in moving towards the rejection of orthodoxy in general. And this had been an ongoing problem for me during my life. I had never sort of I'd never sort of uncritically accepted many of the beliefs and ideas that were handed to me by my elders and parents, etc. And this was a point of tension and conflict in my life. So at any rate, when I made it to college, I discovered, here are a lot of people who think similarly to how I think critically, in other words. And I studied American history, which I think in historical education is a revolutionary education, actually, because you can learn, you have a point of comparison, or points of comparison rather, to critically reflect on your own social situation in the society in which you live when you study history. So it was astonishing to me to see, reading people like Howard Zinn, etc., the conventional radical historians, to see just how far off mainstream interpretations of American life are from the reality of the situation. And I think you probably can see that this type of orientation leads, or can lead, to the place that you and I occupy now, right? So from there,
Hmm.
I turned my attention. I worked for a little while, and then went back and got my master's also at Arizona State in political theory, working with that mentor that I had mentioned earlier. And political theory is basically pure concentrated critical thinking. It's just this amazing discipline that's very actually interdisciplinary and that encourages people to think creatively and I think in utopian and dystopian modes. The original political theorist is Plato. His Republic is, one of the most enormously influential texts in the world, in world history, and that text is a utopian text. So this sort of training and exposure and experience, I think, is key to gaining the tools and the willingness to pierce beyond conventional understandings of our world. And then from there, I ended up now here at Columbia after teaching high school for a few years, which gave me sort of a front row seat to the process of education and learning, which was really important for me actually to see that in fact you can influence people not in the manner of indoctrination, but you can educate people for critical thinking, you can educate for worldviews. And that's such an incredibly powerful and important thing, I think. So that motivated me then to connect my sort of interest and commitment to critical thinking and transformational approaches to social change into a very concrete plan of action, which is education. And now I'm here. And in terms of when I became interested in ecological things, in particular. I think I was thinking about this as I was preparing for the interview. And one of the texts I think that influenced me early on that I didn't really think about was actually The Lord of the Rings, which I read,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
when I was
How many times have I read
so
that?
many
Yeah.
times.
I
Yeah.
mean,
And
it's
I,
basically in my bones.
yes, well, that's good to hear. And
Oh, yeah.
I need to reread it and watch the movies for that matter again. But yeah, I was thinking about it, and I always identified with um, the sort of the world that was passing away, right,
Right.
in Tolkien, right,
Right.
and it's so clearly metaphorical for industrialization
Yeah.
affecting nature, and you have the whole destruction of Fangorn Forest and on and on. So that I think looking back was a foundational influence on me in a way that, and in many ways
Yeah.
actually. Gandalf is a philosopher, for instance, I would argue, and so um, he that character definitely influenced me too.
I never thought about it, but that's a perfect analogy. It's a perfect allegory for what's happening today because we're kind of like, I mean, we're kind of like the elves. We kind of know what's going on and we're sort of, fading away off to the west or something like that. It's funny.
Yeah, it is. It's interesting, and it also shows the importance of narrative and of myth. I think
Hmm.
in today's world that is so dominated by scientism, there's no place for myth, or at least there's little room to recognize the role that myth still plays in our lives, which is um, which is profound.
It is profound. And J.R.R. Tolkien gave us so many profound myths. I actually went on the J.R.R. Tolkien Oxford tour when I was up in Oxford couple of years ago, and it was very interesting to see where he, spent all of his time. I mean, he graduated from Oxford, then he taught at Oxford, and it was incredible to see.
Yeah, I have also visited Oxford, but unfortunately, I didn't know that there was such a tour. I wish I had known. I did
Yeah.
go to the pub where he and C.S. Lewis, I think, used to
Oh
meet.
yeah,
Go there
he
to-
hung out with C.S. Lewis a lot. They were compadres, and they used to
Yep,
go walking around this. Like it's got lots of canals and stuff like that, and little islands, and it's very picturesque, and swans and stags, and it's just glorious. It
I
looks like
know.
Middle Earth. It really does. And they would walk around this island again and again and again, talking and talking and talking. But
Yeah.
sometimes they would walk all night. They were great friends.
Yeah, yeah, it's an amazing history. I love Oxford. I would love to visit again. It's idyllic, I think.
Mhm.
But yeah, so that that
But
oh
myth,
yeah.
I mean,
Mhm.
myth in common culture, we don't have enough of it. We're very linear, we're very scientific. We've kind of forgotten myth. So let's talk about the importance of it.
Sure. Yeah. I completely agree, and I think uh, I that's sort of what's driving me at this point in my own work and my own research is the rec once you if you recognize and accept the significance of myth, then you come to see that in terms of spreading information and persuading people or exposing people, or what sometimes in philosophy is called world disclosure, so disclosing worlds to people, is conducted or can be best conducted through narrative, through fiction, through myth, through dialogue, etc. So I think that for me at this point, I'm seeking a way to present what I presented in that essay that I wrote recently in a more
Mhm.
digestible form, right?
Mhm.
In a more intuitively graspable form. And I think there are people doing this, like Kim Stanley Robinson is a great science fiction writer who writes about, climate change and things like this.
Mhm.
And so I think it can be done, but I want to do it in a sort of explicitly philosophical mode, in the style of Platonic dialogues or something. And I'm very certain about this, that it needs to be done this way.
It's a calling. I can tell by talking with you because, I talk with a lot of people who are interested in, what's happening, the dissolving biosphere, the near-term human extinction of
Right.
life on Earth, little things like that.
Small
And
stuff.
everybody who comes to this and gets involved in it, especially in a public arena, myself included, and so many people that I work with, it becomes sort of bigger than a hobby. It becomes kind of like your raison d'etre. I mean, everything
Yeah.
else you do is kind of an expression of it, enabling you to communicate. What I'm most intrigued with you is your drive and your desire to communicate this message in so many different ways, in ways that
Mhm.
are easily digestible, in ways that are current, in ways that incorporate myth. You are a communicator. You are driven by your soul's need, or whatever you want to call it, to
Yeah.
communicate this message and to connect. You are basically driven to connect. And I think that, if I was going to say, is kind of the thing that's driving you. Am I correct?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, I don't know, it's such a big question, and you're absolutely right that it sort of comes down to this foundational motivation within the soul, or however you want to conceptualize it. But it's like, for me, I guess if I think back, as I was learning about political theory in particular, and I was being exposed to different ideologies, and certain things resonated with me as simply being true, like a Marxian class analysis, for instance, and things like this. And not to say that those analyses are perfect, but that they more nearly map onto empirical reality than the sort of propaganda that we are inundated with, that props up the capitalist order or whatever. So anyway, when you are exposed to things like this and you learn about these things, in my experience, and you're convinced that they're true, it becomes important to you to find other people and to find a way to help other people see the reality of what it is.
So
So
true.
there's almost I don't want to call it evangelizing, but something, you know.
I know what you mean, actually. I really do.
Yeah, I believe it. And it's also, I mean, in some sense, it's for verification or confirmation for yourself. Like, when you are in the minority, or when you do hold minority opinions and beliefs, it's important to have intersubjective verification that you're not crazy, and that's a real thing I think
Right.
that people encounter.
I mean, because when you come to these conclusions, a lot of times what happens, it's a conversation ender. It can be
Yeah,
a relationship ender. I mean, people are not, it's not like people want to understand like your latest insights and understandings with near-term human extinction and the dissolving biosphere and everything else that's going on and abrupt climate change. They just really don't want to hear it.
No.
And it can be lonely to come to these conclusions on your own and then not really have anybody to talk about the thing that is really kind of welling up in your soul and driving you crazy, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And what I so those obstacles, right, where people shut down or they don't want to hear it or they just kind of nod and go along until you change the topic, all those kinds of things, I started to consider them from an educational perspective and to wonder what are the obstacles impeding people's comprehension or even recognition of some of the things that you and I take as simply being the case, right, as simply being true about empirical reality. And one of the big ones for me is explained through terror management theory, which I reference in the essay, which is the idea, it's a whole theory within social psychology. It's the idea that all cultural activity is conducted at its root for the purpose of repressing or assuaging our fears about our own mortality. And so people have defense mechanisms, in other words, unconsciously and consciously operating to shield them from contemplating death or extinction, right?
Yeah,
And this,
absolutely. Absolutely. There's just like blinders. I mean, it's almost like cognitive dissonance sets in. And when you really want to adhere to a view, you
yes,
will adhere to that view come hell or high water, literally speaking. You could be
right,
hit with a tornado or a hurricane of massive monolithic proportions, or you could receive suddenly 50 inches of rain and have your entire life destroyed. And if
yeah,
you have those blinders in place, there is such a high degree of filtration that you will fight for your point of view because that is your description of the world and it's attached to your values and
yes,
it's attached to everything that you hold dear. And it also has other implications and political implications. And so it really doesn't matter if it's real or not. What really matters is that you adhere to your point of view. And so therefore, the fight becomes all the stronger and people are like that crazy, and I think
mm,
they're that crazy because they're fighting against this view and it makes them insane.
yes, yes, I completely agree. And there's a ton of research on this topic in lots of different disciplines. But yeah, people consistently will double down on their beliefs because, as you mentioned, those beliefs are intimately tied to and constitutive of those persons' identities, how they conceive of themselves. So, in order to change their fundamental beliefs, it will require them to become different people. And that's a tall order, especially when people are under duress. And so it's much easier, for instance, to turn to scapegoating, as we're seeing in the American political conversation now. Instead of trying to address the very real issues that we face, let's just build a border wall. These preposterous, it's magical thinking in service of preserving these beliefs. And those are true across the board. I think as they apply to climate and ecology, how can we have so many people in this country who deny climate change or deny the role of human activity in affecting the climate?
Yeah.
Uh, it,
Well, I understand why there are so many people who are, saying that climate change isn't real, but what really that's kind of like a level of mass ignorance that's being perpetuated by a strategy, and the strategy is the thing that really upsets me. So I was just kind of surfing around the web like a little bit earlier yesterday and today, and I came across like, Arctic sea ice decline debunked, and I'm like, oh my
yeah,
God, I have to watch this. And so I went in and I watched it, and it was a masterful treatment of cherry-picked data. And if I didn't know my science as well as I know my science, and I watched that, and it was kind of almost like a quiz. It was like, oh, okay, he's cherry-picking this data, I'm taking it on this, because I was watching, he was picking like year 2007, year 2012, and then very short ranges in between that made it appear all these things. And then I looked at and it got like a huge number of views, and I looked at the comments, and it's like, oh, great, masterful work and all this stuff. And I'm like, oh my God, this is like the most evil thing. I can't even believe it. So it's the media conspiracy that's really contrived and funded and perpetuated that's really distressing me. And it's because they don't want people to see it. And I know why they don't want people to see it, because, you know, civilization, as we know, would stop and there would be extreme panic and all this stuff. But, you know, that in itself, I mean, I think we kind of need to talk about that if you feel up for it. Do you feel like you want to talk about that?
Yeah, that's an important topic, actually. And I think it's a difficult one for a lot of people to grasp, especially because I think what people are desperately seeking for right now is some semblance of certainty. And so simplistic narratives perpetuated by corporate media, for example, provide people with the certainty that they are seeking in a world that is characterized by rapid and dangerous changes. So, you know, for me, sort of the landmark here would be Noam Chomsky's work on manufacturing consent, right, which is still operative even in the face of the disruption of mass media by the internet. Consent is still being manufactured by corporate interests. Those interests may have shifted or expanded from just CBS and ABC, et cetera, to now Facebook and other large internet corporations are involved. But nevertheless, narratives are being shaped in exactly the way that you were just describing, shaped and reinforced. And that is a frightening prospect, especially because, for me right now anyway, I see consent being manufactured for war with Russia, with the entire narrative of their hacking of our election. There's some empirical evidence, of course, that efforts were made by Russian agents and operatives to meddle, so-called, with the 2016 election. But even accepting that, to then move to this position in the mainstream media where it's so clearly resembling the former Red Scares that we've gone through in this country and the saber rattling. I just feel like in the face of all of the ecological devastation that is ongoing right now worldwide, we don't need anything pushing us any closer to the brink of nuclear war. And so this is not only problematic on its own, but the mass media focuses on simplistic narratives like this to the exclusion of more complex and less attention grabbing, maybe, information that would nevertheless be much more important to actually figuring out what we should do as a society moving forward.
I would say zero attention is paid to climate change. It's still sort of poo-pooed as some sort of woo-woo, and just kind of like, I don't even really understand how that happens, you know, but it's pretty masterful. And, you know, the main media is not covering it much, but, you know, the abrupt climate change events are getting worse and worse. You know, most notably the hurricanes are just like so amazingly like, you can't even believe, you know, wiping out whole islands and stuff like that. And it's like, you know, yeah, we cover like the trauma and everything like that, and then it's gone, but it's not like the source, it's not dealt with as a topic. I mean, do you kind of see like they're just not dealing with the Arctic and the you know, the Arctic melting, and, you know, the temperature difference is going down, it's causing huge jet stream problems. I mean, it's not being dealt with, right?
No, and it is that in and of itself, I think, for folks who are paying attention is even more frightening. It's sort of like our house is on fire, and instead of getting up and getting out, people are just calmly sitting at the table talking about what they had for breakfast. And I have seen a little coverage about the situation in the Arctic, because recently the temperatures were so ridiculously high, like 40 degrees above normal or whatever. So there was a tiny blip of coverage, but even that was mostly in marginalized or minority news sources like Democracy Now, which is something I watch frequently, but non-corporate sources that have minimal viewership really and little impact on policy decisions, for example. But I don't know. I don't know. I guess my sort of open question would be like, how long can we ignore what's going on? For how much longer, and what kinds of crazy stories will we have to come up with to convince ourselves that nothing is happening? You know, if you look at the time lapse of the Arctic, that there's one that NASA put out a couple years ago that's only like 2 minutes long, but it shows the pulsing and the growth cycle of the Arctic ice, and it's so clearly reaching what is basically organ failure for the Earth. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that's going
Yeah.
to disrupt the climate and push it out of the range, the sort of homeostasis or the equilibrium in which humans evolved as a species, right? And that's a terrifying prospect, I think. And but you know, to your point, people aren't talking about it in mainstream news.
Mm-mm.
Why? For many reasons, I think they have short-sighted reasons, incentives, economic incentives for not doing that. But of course, we can dig a little deeper and say MSNBC is owned by Comcast, formerly owned by General Electric, which is a defense contractor. All of these corporations are deeply bound up in the oil economy, so to speak. So
Yeah.
they
Yeah,
have incentives.
the reality narrative is being very, very tightly controlled at
Mm,
all levels, even on liberal stations. I mean, it's kind of just watching a play. It's like, well, this liberal one and this conservative one are going to fight and all this stuff. And then it's like they're spouting the same narrative. Ultimately, nobody's really looking at the severity of the crisis of the dissolution of our biosphere and the global warming event that's currently underway, giving rise to the abrupt climate change. Is just not being dealt with. It's being talked about in usually like web sort of publications like Extinction Radio. I mean, Radio EcoShock is a wild, wonderful show. I don't know if you've ever watched it, but they
no.
talk about it there. But radioecoshock.org is fabulous. You can find that, and Alex Smith is an incredible host, and it's a weekly show, so you might want to check that out. A lot of different kind of web-based shows are starting to take a look at this, and I'm sure Democracy Now does too, but very little information of this nature is really shared on the main networks. Have you noticed that?
Yes, absolutely. And even the effects are not discussed. So let's be generous and say that talking about the causes it's too abstract, it's too complicated or whatever, and it wouldn't get any attention. But then why not talk about the effects also? So for example, the situation in Puerto Rico, collapse so-called, has arrived there, right? They got crushed by a hurricane and are now just undergoing a horrible situation for what, 6 months now or something longer.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so it's here for them, and they are American citizens, but very little attention is paid to them. And this follows in a pattern going back to Katrina, for example, Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, where these disasters stemming from climate change have already arrived, and yet we can't even bring ourselves to admit that they are connected,
Can't
right?
admit it, and then let's not mention the exponential sea level rise on the East Coast. A lot of the places of the East Coast in the United States, I'm sure you're aware of this, is
Yeah.
already kind of going down on their own a little bit anyway. So sea level rise is going to be a lot more extreme there. I mean, but we're still outlawing the word climate change in different places, like I think they did for a long time in North Carolina, not allow the new sea level rise predictions be included in the building codes, and they
Mm.
actually disallowed the new science. And it's like, I have so little hope for our world because of the way our species is responding to this thing that's like right in front of us. I mean, how do you keep going in the midst of like that sort of reality?
Yeah, that's the big one for me, I think also, because it's like how you can see it so clearly, and I kind of think of it as like turning to your friend and saying like, do you see that? And they say no. Like, yeah, it's really happening. It's really there. And the denial and things of that nature are just, it can be dispiriting, I guess I might say, having to encounter this in so many different ways. But
Yeah.
I think it goes, for me, I try to connect it to my interests in consciousness and developmental psychology.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
I think, um, there are ways that we can educate and that we can change ourselves as human beings, to make us more able to understand our world. And so that's sort of vague and abstract, but what do I mean by that? Like, we have to actually develop certain capacities within us as humans in order to comprehend the environment in which we exist. And if those potentialities are left undeveloped, then we are blind in a certain sense. So education, for one example, would be what's called formal operational thinking in developmental psychology. It's the ability to think abstractly, hypothetically, to make deductions and draw conclusions. And there have been studies that show that in American high schools and other industrialized countries' high schools, less than half of the students are educated in a way that they achieve the ability to think in formal operational terms. So in other words, these people are walking
We
around.
don't even have the tools to make these thoughts. What's
Right.
happening to us? Are we devolving?
No, that's the thing. Yes, so it's incredibly right. It sounds awful, and it is awful, but in fact, it's always been abnormal to think in these kinds of ways. And even the scientific method itself. Think about when the scientific method itself emerged. It's not that old. Within the evolutionary history of our species, right? So we're still trying to bring ourselves up to this level. There's an easy argument to say, well, this is such a grand historical process and we just don't have enough time in the face of climate breakdown, et cetera, et cetera. But that's what motivates me, is that I know that it's possible for people to develop these capacities, to reach the ability to think abstractly and form hypotheses. And then beyond that would be systems level thinking, which I think is really what's necessary for
Right.
understanding
Right.
the,
We kind of have to upgrade our chips, and we have to like
yeah,
become cray computers now. We have to like get smarter. We have to be able to fire on more circuits simultaneously to kind of form these more cohesive model thoughts, And that's
yes.
what's happening anyway, I do think. I think that a lot of people are waking up and being able to synthesize all this information at once, don't you? Do you
Mm.
see a change?
I do. I think, I mean, as much as it is sort of expunged from mainstream discourse, discussing even climate change, let alone more drastic things. At the same time, you have the flip side of that, which is the phenomenon of people piecing things together on their own. And for me, that's the great promise of the internet, right? There's great peril in reinforcing worldviews, in people's epistemic bubbles, basically. But at the same time, just by being exposed to other perspectives, that exposure in and of itself changes people.
Right.
And like a very simple example, I think, would be the political example of police violence against blacks in America. This has been ongoing forever, but now there are videos that are shown and spread virally, and people can't deny the reality of it anymore. So
Very
that's sort
sweet.
of, yeah, that's sort of like a straightforward example. But if you start piecing together things relating to the climate in the same way, then there's an image that you see that you have to then either distrust your own eyes or change your view of the world.
See, that's what it is, changing our view of the world. And we're so attached to our view of the world and the way it's put together. And these are different thoughts. These are foreign thoughts. They're not
Yeah.
thoughts that but we put together all these pieces of information. Have you ever heard the story of the blind men and the elephant? Do you know the story
Yeah.
of the blind
Yes.
men of the elephant? Well, that's how we are. We're like little blind men or little blind beings, and we're all like on one part of the globe, and we're kind of like, wrapping our worldview around our very immediate experience around something that's, very, very large. And,
Mm,
you put all those pieces of the puzzle together, and then all of a sudden you start to form a more cohesive view. And then people start to research and they start, delving into these ideas, and they go into YouTube and they start searching for different strings, and information leads to information. And before you know it, you filled in enough of the blanks that you've got a pretty cohesive worldview about the what's happening in the degrading biosphere and how it's moving. You can almost start to see it pulsing, and you understand how these different things are happening. But what you've done, you've changed your worldview due
right.
to information. So social media is very powerful, don't you think?
Yes, I completely agree. And um, the transformation of worldview is itself um, an interesting developmental process, and some scholars have studied this. Um, and I think that what they show is that it can be systematically pursued through an educational program. And that's what I'm interested in trying to figure out, how to use the internet, social media as a tool to deliberately transform people's worldviews, right? So that this is disclosed to them, this reality that exists, but they are unaware of, is disclosed to them. And I think I talk about this in the TED talk I gave years ago, the idea of identity development that goes hand in hand with worldview transformation, which is imagery going back to the Stoics of concentric circles that
Mm,
expand outward, right? So when you're born, like say I was in a small rural area, your world is circumscribed.
mhm,
It's very small. It's your town. My hometown was like 5,000 people, and that was my world, and I couldn't even imagine alternatives to it.
mhm.
Well, as you grow and travel and things like this, and you read and you're exposed to more things, suddenly your world expands and you start thinking in more inclusive terms. And so folks like Ken Wilber, for example, really push for this idea that we can develop what he calls world-centric identity or consciousness, which is identity with the entire human
Mhm,
species
mhm.
everywhere throughout the globe, so that those divisions of race and nationality, et cetera, drop away. And the great hope then is that increased coordination and cooperation can arise. And this is why I do have some hope, is because if people realize that we're in a crisis situation, if you think of Earth as spaceship Earth, as Buckminster Fuller and others have called it, we're all on this ship together. The ship is functionally sinking. If we wake up and realize, like, hey, the ship is sinking, we can turn to each other and say, you want to try and bail it out? Now it might be too late, right? But we can still try and mitigate as best we can.
We can at least say it's happening so we
Right.
can mitigate. I mean,
Right.
recognition is liberation. That's one of the tenets of I don't know, the Upanishads or something like that,
Sure.
or
Yep.
Buddhism or something, whatever it is. It's kind of true though. I mean, you think of it, recognition is liberation. First you have to recognize something, and then once you recognize something, perhaps you can start to deal with it. But until there's adaptation of an idea and it's recognized, you will be powerless to do anything. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, Rory, that might be what's driving you.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And
Mhm.
uh, yeah, like there is, I want to get to that point where people are all on the same page, right?
Mhm.
Um, and it's incredibly frustrating to encounter all the different, essentially, lies or fictions or whatever that people make up to shield themselves from looking around and acknowledging what's going on. And I mean, literally, in my view, this kind of awareness is what drove like Ted Kaczynski crazy, for instance, you know. Certainly not endorsing his methods, but I think if you actually read his manifesto about industrial society, he was horrified about the consequences of the way of life that we have adopted as a species, and it drove him mad in some sense. And I think that we should be very aware. And I think really this is one reason why the near-term human extinction support group exists, is to admit and recognize and try to forthrightly deal with the mental and psychological consequences and effects of grappling with this kind of dangerous information.
It messes with you big time. This is not a show for kids.
No, no, definitely not. And yeah, so then that's another challenge that I think also loops back into my conviction that that narrative and myth are so important for conveying this information, because, and humor especially also, because you can wrap this information up in to make it more palatable, to make it less threatening, even though it's always going to be threatening. But if you can just find a way to point towards it instead of like shoving it in people's faces, then I think people are more receptive.
Mm-hmm.
At least in my experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
absolutely true. And I think that's kind of the raison d'etre of the, of Extinction Radio, and what we do here is we try and wrap it up. And it's not really pointing people to anything, because anyone who's come to Extinction Radio has figured this out already. But then there's sort of like, you love to kind of commiserate with people and have humor, and, life goes on nonetheless. So, how do you deal with it? So we have like the science, we have the psychology, we have humor, we have cartoons. We try and make it light, but it's a lot to deal with. So, totally understand. So
Yeah.
anyway, Rory, it's been such a pleasure interviewing with you today on Extinction Radio. I hope that we can have you back in the future. Is there anything that you'd like to say to our listeners in parting, in summary, before we end this today?
Well, first, thanks for having me. I did love the conversation and would certainly like to come back. In terms of a parting message, no, just, stay strong and try to keep it on, I guess. One thing is that I'll be giving a talk this coming Monday, if for anybody who's in the New York area, at Teachers College, titled Love in the Age of Extinction. And I'll be discussing these issues that we discussed today and connecting them to film and television. And hopefully I'll be able to put that on YouTube as well.
That's fabulous. I did see that you were going to be giving that talk in New York. So everybody, it's Love in the Age of Extinction. Rory Varrato, it's been such a pleasure having you here today on Extinction Radio. So thanks, and take care.
Thanks, you too.